On a cold morning in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, a woman stumbled upon something strange partially buried in the ground. It wasn't just an ordinary rock, but the outline of a giant skull. That woman was Elaine Rhodes, a retired teacher who spent her days wandering lonely trails in search of fossils to show her grandchildren. She had no idea she was about to reopen a mystery that had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. Her discovery was handed over to local authorities, but it was quickly shelved and forgotten. But 17 years later, when a team of scientists decided to re-examine that strange skull, the truth finally came to light, and what they found left even the experts in silence. The morning mist clung to the Rocky Mountains like a ghostly shroud as Elaine Rhodes adjusted her worn leather backpack and continued down the familiar trail. At 67, the retired science teacher had made this journey countless times over the past 3 years, always searching for something interesting to show her grandchildren. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of chalk dust and laboratory chemicals, gripped her walking stick as she navigated the rocky terrain with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime exploring the natural world. The crisp October air bit at her cheeks, but Elaine barely noticed the cold. Her mind was occupied with thoughts of her grandson Tommy's upcoming birthday. At 8 years old, he had developed an insatiable curiosity about dinosaurs, fossils, and anything that might unlock the secrets of the past. Her other grandchildren, Sarah and little Emma, were equally fascinated by the treasures their grandmother brought back from her mountain expeditions. "Grandma, when are you going to bring us something really cool?" Tommy's voice echoed in her memory from their last visit. She had shown him a perfectly preserved leaf fossil, but his eyes had lit up only briefly before returning to his video games. She was determined to find something that would truly capture his imagination. The trail wound through a section she had explored dozens of times before, but something felt different this morning. Perhaps it was the way the early sunlight filtered through the pine trees, or how the recent autumn rains had washed away layers of accumulated debris. As she crested a small ridge, her trained eye caught something that made her pause. Partially buried between loose stones and frozen earth lay a shape that didn't belong in the natural landscape. It was too regular, too purposeful to be a random rock formation. Elaine's heart quickened as she approached, her scientific instincts honed by 35 years of teaching biology and earth sciences taking over. She knelt carefully, her knees protesting against the cold mountain ground, and began delicately removing dirt and debris with her gloved hands. Years of archaeological documentaries and her own amateur fossil hunting had taught her to work slowly, methodically. As the form became clearer, her breath caught in her throat. "My God," she whispered to the empty wilderness. It wasn't just an ordinary rock. The curved surface, the distinctive eye sockets, the unmistakable structure. It was clearly part of a skull. But not just any skull. This was a skull of impossible proportions, much larger than any human skull she had ever encountered in her decades of studying anatomy charts and museum specimens. Her hands trembling with excitement rather than cold, Elaine pulled out her phone and began documenting her discovery. She took photographs from every conceivable angle, making sure to include her hand for scale, then carefully measured the exposed portion with a small ruler she always carried in her field kit. The visible section alone measured over 15 inches in length. As she continued her careful excavation, removing centuries of accumulated soil and organic matter, the true magnitude of her discovery became apparent. The skull was nearly 2 feet in length, almost twice the size of a normal human skull. The bone structure appeared ancient, weathered by countless seasons, yet remarkably well preserved in the dry mountain climate. Elaine sat back on her heels, staring at what she had uncovered. Her scientific mind raced through possibilities. Could this be some unknown species? A deformed animal skull? But the more she examined it, the more convinced she became that this was fundamentally human in structure, just impossibly large. The drive back to Boulder seemed to take forever. Elaine's mind was spinning with questions and possibilities. She had always been a methodical person, someone who followed proper procedures and channels. Her first stop would be the sheriff's office. Surely they would know how to handle such a significant discovery. 3 days later, Elaine sat across from Detective Mike Morrison at the Boulder County Sheriff's Office, watching him flip through the printed photographs with an expression that grew more skeptical by the moment. Morrison was a large man in his early 50s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of too many years dealing with the eccentricities of mountain communities. "Mrs. Rhodes, with all due respect, you're telling me you found a giant skull?" Morrison's voice carried the weary tone of someone who had heard too many tall tales from enthusiastic amateur explorers. Elaine straightened in her chair, drawing on decades of experience dealing with skeptical students and doubtful parents. "I'm not saying it's from a giant, detective. I'm saying I found something that appears to be a skull of anomalous size. Perhaps it's from an extinct species, or represents some kind of genetic condition we don't fully understand. Or maybe it's from a deformed elk, or a bear with some kind of bone disease, or any number of large animals that roam these mountains," Morrison interrupted, pushing the photos back across his desk with barely concealed impatience. "Look, Mrs. Rhodes, I admire your scientific curiosity, but I can't mobilize department resources for every unusual rock formation someone discovers during their weekend hikes." The dismissive tone stung more than Elaine had expected. "Detective Morrison, I was a science teacher for 35 years. I've studied comparative anatomy, I've taken my students to natural history museums, and I've helped identify animal remains for other investigations. I know the difference between animal bones and human skeletal structures. This is neither normal nor natural." Morrison leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily, the sound of a man who had dealt with one too many conspiracy theorists and amateur archaeologists. "Fine. Leave the GPS coordinates with me. If we manage to find some spare time and manpower, maybe we'll send a deputy up there to take a look." But even as she carefully wrote down the precise coordinates, Elaine could see in Morrison's eyes that no deputy would ever make that trip. The photographs would end up in some forgotten file, another eccentric report from the endless parade of citizens who were convinced they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. The rejection at the sheriff's office was just the beginning of a 17-year odyssey that would test Elaine's resolve in ways she never imagined. Over the following months, she methodically contacted every relevant institution she could find. She called the anthropology departments at the University of Colorado, Colorado State University, and the Colorado School of Mines. She reached out to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, the National Park Service, and even the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Each conversation followed a depressingly familiar pattern. Initial polite interest would quickly give way to skepticism when she described the size of the skull. Most experts assumed she had misidentified animal remains or fallen victim to an optical illusion caused by unusual rock formations. Some suggested she had discovered the skull of a bear or elk that had suffered from some form of bone disease. Dr. Patricia Williams at the University of Colorado's Anthropology Department was typical of the responses she received. "Mrs. Rhodes, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The largest confirmed human skulls in the archaeological record are only slightly larger than modern averages. What you're describing would represent a complete anomaly in human evolution. But wouldn't that make it worth investigating? Elaine had asked. In theory, yes. But we receive dozens of similar reports each year from well-meaning citizens who have misidentified natural formations or animal remains. Without proper context, provenance, and preliminary analysis by qualified field archaeologists, we simply can't justify the expense of a full expedition. The conversation with Dr. Margaret Chen at the Smithsonian was even more discouraging. Mrs. Rhodes, I've reviewed your photographs, and while I can see why you might be intrigued, I'm afraid what you've found appears to be a natural rock formation that coincidentally resembles cranial features. This type of pareidolia, seeing familiar shapes in random patterns, is extremely common in geological formations. But Elaine knew what she had seen and touched. The smooth texture of bone, the precise anatomical features, the unmistakable structure of eye sockets and nasal cavities, these were not tricks of light or imagination. Each rejection only strengthened her resolve. But as the months turned into years, the constant dismissal began to wear on her spirit. Her family tried to be supportive, but even they began to express gentle concerns about her obsession with the skull. Her daughter, Linda, finally voiced what everyone was thinking during a family dinner in 2010. "Mom, maybe it's time to let this go. You've tried everything, contacted everyone. Maybe the experts are right." Elaine looked around the table at her children and grandchildren, seeing the mixture of love, concern, and gentle skepticism in their faces. Only young Sarah, now 14 and fascinated by her grandmother's stories, seemed to maintain unwavering faith in the discovery. "Grandma," Sarah said quietly, "I believe you found something important. Maybe the grown-ups just aren't ready to listen yet." As the years passed, Elaine continued to return to the site periodically, always hoping to find additional evidence that might convince the skeptics. She became intimately familiar with every rock, every tree, every seasonal change in the area. She documented weather patterns, took soil samples, and even taught herself basic principles of archaeological fieldwork through online courses and library research. But the skull remained her only concrete evidence, and without institutional support, she lacked the resources to conduct the kind of systematic excavation that might reveal additional remains or artifacts. By 2015, 15 years after her initial discovery, Elaine had almost resigned herself to taking her secret to the grave. At 82, she was still healthy and active, but she could feel the weight of advancing age. The mountain trails that had once felt like home now required more effort and careful planning. It was during this period of near despair that Sarah, now 20 and a junior archaeology student at the University of Colorado, brought new life to the old mystery during one of their regular tea times. "Grandma, I've been thinking about your skull again," Sarah said, settling into the familiar routine of examining the photographs that had remained in their green album for over a decade. "Oh, sweetheart, I appreciate your loyalty, but I think maybe everyone else was right. Maybe I was just a foolish old woman who got carried away by her imagination." Sarah looked up sharply from the photos. "Grandma, don't you dare say that. You're the smartest person I know, and you taught me never to give up when I believe in something important." "But Sarah, I've tried everything. Every expert, every institution." "But that was 15 years ago, Grandma. Think about how much technology has advanced. We have ground-penetrating radar, 3D imaging, DNA analysis that can work with samples thousands of years old, carbon dating techniques that are far more precise than anything available in 2000. Sarah leaned forward with the intensity that reminded Elaine so much of her younger self. And more importantly, I'm not a little girl anymore. I'm a serious archaeology student with access to professors who specialize in exactly this kind of discovery. Dr. James Mitchell, my forensic anthropology professor, has worked on some of the most important prehistoric finds in North America. Elaine felt a flutter of hope that she had thought was permanently extinguished. Do you really think he might listen? Grandma, Doctor. Mitchell's entire reputation is built on taking on cases that other people dismissed as impossible. He discovered evidence of pre-Clovis settlement in New Mexico that everyone said couldn't exist. He's exactly the kind of scientist who might be intrigued by a mystery that's been ignored for 17 years. A week later, Sarah arranged a meeting that would change everything. Dr. James Mitchell's office was exactly what Elaine had imagined. Walls lined with archaeological journals, shelves filled with carefully labeled bone fragments and artifacts, and the organized chaos of a mind constantly engaged with humanity's distant past. Dr. Mitchell himself was younger than Elaine had expected, perhaps in his mid-40s, with the kind of intense, focused energy that marked someone who had found his true calling. His reputation in the field was formidable. He was known for his meticulous methodology, his willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, and his to extract extraordinary information from the most unpromising evidence. Mrs. Rhodus Doctor, Mitchell said, settling behind his desk with Sarah's folder of photographs, Sarah has told me quite a story about your discovery. I have to admit, I'm intrigued. As he examined each photograph with a professional eye, using a magnifying glass to study details that previous experts had dismissed, Elaine found herself holding her breath. This was her last chance, her final opportunity to convince a qualified scientist that her discovery deserved serious investigation. "These are remarkable images, Doctor," Mitchell said finally, looking up at Elaine with an expression she hadn't seen in 17 years of rejections. "The bone structure is clearly humanoid, but the proportions are unlike anything in the standard archaeological record." "Dr. Mitchell," Elaine said carefully, "I understand that what I'm claiming sounds impossible. But I've spent 17 years thinking about this, returning to the site, studying everything I could find about human skeletal variation. I'm not a crackpot or a publicity seeker. I'm just someone who found something that doesn't fit our current understanding." Dr. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Mrs. Rhodes, in my experience, the most important discoveries often begin with observations that don't fit our existing frameworks. The question is whether we have the courage to investigate when the evidence challenges our preconceptions." He paused, studying the photographs one more time. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Is there any possibility, however remote, that you could be mistaken about what you found?" Elaine met his gaze directly. "Dr. Mitchell, I've spent 17 years asking myself that same question. I've considered every alternative explanation, every possibility for error or misidentification. The answer is no. I know what I found, and I know it's important." "Then we're going to find out exactly what that is. Sarah, I want you to organize a full expedition team. We'll need ground-penetrating radar, a complete excavation kit, a forensic photographer, and a team of graduate students who can handle detailed site documentation." Sarah's face lit up with excitement. "But Doctor..." Mitchell held up a cautioning hand. "Mrs. Rhodes, you need to understand that if we do this, it will be a complete scientific investigation. Every procedure will be documented, every finding will be subjected to peer review, and the results will be published regardless of what we discover. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Elaine felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. After 17 years of rejection and dismissal, someone was finally taking her seriously. Dr. Mitchell, I've been ready for that scrutiny since the day I made this discovery. The expedition was scheduled for the following Monday, and Elaine spent the weekend in a state of nervous anticipation, unlike anything she had experienced since her teaching days. What if they found nothing? What if 17 years of certainty had been built on a foundation of self-delusion? But deeper than her fears was a conviction that had sustained her through nearly 2 decades of skepticism. She knew what she had found was real. Monday morning dawned clear and cold, perfect conditions for archaeological work. The expedition team consisted of 6 people: Dr. Mitchell, Sarah, 2 graduate students named Marcus, and Jennifer, a geological specialist named Dr. Rodriguez, and a forensic photographer who would document every stage of the excavation process. As they hiked up the familiar trail, Elaine found herself in the strange position of being both guide and subject of investigation. The team followed her through terrain she could navigate blindfolded, past landmarks that had become as familiar as her own backyard. "Here," Elaine announced when they reached the location marked by her carefully maintained stack of stones. "This is exactly where I found it." Dr. Mitchell surveyed the area with the practiced eye of someone who had conducted dozens of similar excavations. 17 years of weather and natural processes had covered the site with new layers of debris and vegetation, but the underlying geology was exactly as Elaine had described. "Team, establish the excavation perimeter," Dr. Mitchell commanded with the authority of someone accustomed to leading complex field operations. "We'll use a standard 1-meter grid system. I want every square centimeter photographed and catalogued before we remove so much as a pebble." The work began with painstaking slowness. This was not the romantic vision of archaeology portrayed in adventure movies, but the meticulous, scientific process of gradually revealing the past through careful documentation and analysis. Every layer of soil was examined, sifted, and catalogued. Every fragment of organic matter was collected for potential analysis. 3 hours into the excavation, Marcus called out from his assigned grid square. "Dr. Mitchell, I think I've found something." The team gathered around as Marcus carefully brushed away centuries of accumulated soil to reveal a curved section of what was unmistakably bone. But as more of the structure became visible, a profound silence fell over the excavation site. "Jesus Christ," whispered Jennifer, the normally composed graduate student, as the full scope of Marcus's discovery became apparent. Dr. Mitchell knelt beside the emerging skull, his professional composure cracking for the first time since Elaine had met him. The bone structure was not only perfectly preserved, but even more remarkable than the photographs had suggested. The skull was massive, easily twice the size of any human skull in the archaeological record, but unmistakably human in its basic anatomy. "Mrs. Rhodes, Doctor," Mitchell said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology, and so does every expert who dismissed your discovery." As the excavation continued throughout the day, the team uncovered not just the skull but sections of other bones. A femur that suggested the individual would have stood nearly 9 feet tall, rib bones of proportional size, and fragments of what appeared to be deliberately worked stone tools. Dr. Mitchell was now working with the intensity of someone who realized he was in the presence of a discovery that would rewrite textbooks. "We need to expand the excavation grid. If there's one individual here, there may be others. And we need to get these samples to multiple laboratories for independent analysis." The mood of the team had transformed from professional skepticism to barely controlled excitement. This was clearly not an animal skull, not a geological formation, not any of the mundane explanations that had been offered for 17 years. This was something unprecedented in the archaeological record of North America. As the sun began to set over the Colorado mountains, Dr. Mitchell called a halt to the day's work. The exposed remains were carefully covered and secured, but everyone knew that their lives had been changed by what they had witnessed. "Mrs. Rhodes, Doctor," Mitchell said as they packed up their equipment, "I need you to know that what we found today will require years of analysis and verification. There will be skeptics, there will be controversy, and there will be people who try to dismiss or debunk these findings." "Dr. Mitchell," Elaine replied, "I've been dealing with skeptics and dismissal for 17 years. I think I can handle whatever comes next." The next 2 months were a whirlwind of laboratory analysis, consultation with experts around the world, and increasingly excited communication between team members as test results began to confirm what they had hardly dared to hope. Dr. Elena Vasquez at the FBI Forensic Genetics Laboratory in Quantico was the first to deliver results that would shake the archaeological community to its foundations. "Dr. Mitchell," she said during their scheduled conference call, "I need you to sit down before I share these findings." "I'm sitting, Elena. What did you discover?" "The DNA analysis confirms that these remains are definitely human. Homo sapiens, no question about it. But the genetic markers are unlike anything in our database. There are indicators of a naturally occurring genetic variation that produced gigantism, but without any of the pathological conditions we associate with modern cases of extreme height." Dr. Mitchell felt his heart racing. "What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying that these remains represent a human population that was naturally tall to an extent we've never seen before. And Dr. Mitchell, the carbon dating results came back this morning. And these bones are approximately 12,000 years old." The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute as Dr. Mitchell processed the implications of what he was hearing. They had discovered evidence of a population of giant humans living in North America at the end of the last ice age. A finding that challenged every existing theory about human migration and development in the Americas. "Elena, are you absolutely certain about these results?" "We've run the tests 3 times using different methodologies. The results are consistent across all analyses. Dr. Mitchell, you've discovered something that will rewrite the textbooks." The formal presentation of their findings took place 6 weeks later in the main auditorium of the University of Colorado, before an audience of archaeologists, anthropologists, geneticists, and science journalists from around the world. Word of the discovery had begun to leak through professional networks, and the anticipation was palpable. Elaine sat in the front row, flanked by Sarah and other family members who had finally understood the magnitude of what their grandmother had discovered. At 84, she had lived to see complete vindication of nearly 2 decades of unwavering conviction. Dr. Mitchell approached the podium with the gravity appropriate to someone about to announce one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the century. "Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and members of the press," he began, "after 3 months of rigorous analysis conducted by multiple independent laboratories, I can now confirm that the remains discovered by Mrs. Elaine Rhodes represent not just a significant archaeological finding, but a discovery that fundamentally challenges our understanding of human history in North America." The auditorium fell into complete silence as the implications of his words began to sink in. The skeletal remains belonged to a male individual who lived approximately 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. Genetic analysis confirms that this individual was fully human, Homo sapiens, but possessed a naturally occurring genetic variation that produced extreme height without the pathological conditions typically associated with gigantism in modern populations. He clicked to the next slide, showing a computer reconstruction of the complete skeleton. Based on our analysis of the available bones, we estimate this individual stood between 8.8 and 9.2 feet tall. Subsequent excavation of the site has revealed 3 additional individuals with similar characteristics, along with sophisticated stone tools and evidence of complex social organization. A journalist in the third row raised her hand. "Dr. Mitchell, are you saying there was an entire population of giants living in prehistoric North America?" The evidence strongly suggests that what we've discovered represents a distinct population group characterized by extreme height that coexisted with other human populations during the terminal Pleistocene period. This finding has profound implications for our understanding of human genetic diversity and migration patterns in prehistoric North America. After the presentation, Doctor, Mitchell found Elaine surrounded by reporters and well-wishers. When he finally managed to reach her, he took her hands in his and looked directly into her eyes. "Mrs. Rhodes, I cannot adequately express how sorry I am that it took 17 years for the scientific community to take your discovery seriously. Your persistence in the face of universal skepticism demonstrates the kind of intellectual courage that drives all great discoveries." Elaine smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally been vindicated after nearly 2 decades of doubt and dismissal. "Dr. Mitchell, the important thing is that the truth finally came to light. That's all I ever wanted." Sarah hugged her grandmother tightly. "Grandma, do you realize that archaeological sites are going to be named after you? You're going to be in history books." "You know what makes me happiest?" Elaine said, looking around at the excited crowd discussing the implications of her discovery. "Tommy is 15 now, and when I tell him about this, he's finally going to think his grandmother brought home something really cool." The discovery of what became known as the Rhodes Site fundamentally altered scientific understanding of prehistoric North America. Follow-up excavations revealed evidence of a sophisticated culture that had developed unique technologies adapted to their extraordinary physical characteristics. The genetic analysis opened new avenues of research into human evolutionary biology and the incredible diversity of ancient populations. But perhaps more importantly, Elaine Rhodes became a symbol of the importance of listening to ordinary citizens who make extraordinary claims. Her story inspired reforms in how academic institutions evaluate reports from amateur discoverers, leading to the establishment of citizen science programs that take seriously the observations of people who spend their lives exploring the natural world. 2 years after the initial presentation, the Denver Museum of Natural History opened a permanent exhibition titled "The Colorado Giants: How Elaine Rhodes Changed History." The centerpiece was a complete reconstruction of the giant skeleton, surrounded by the stone tools and other artifacts recovered from the site. Elaine, now 86 but still vigorous, served as a volunteer docent, sharing her story with thousands of visitors who came to see physical evidence of a chapter of human history that had been completely unknown just a few years earlier. The most important lesson, she would tell school groups who came to see the exhibition, is that truth has a way of persisting even when everyone refuses to believe it. If you ever discover something that seems impossible, don't let other people's disbelief convince you to abandon what you know is real. Sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries are made by the most ordinary people who simply refuse to give up. Her discovery had not only rewritten the textbooks, but had also inspired a new generation of citizen scientists who understood that the next great discovery might be waiting in their own backyard, buried beneath centuries of accumulated doubt, and ready to be revealed by someone with the courage to keep digging when everyone else had given up.